For thousand years of human history, there will always exist those who lack a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. The condition is called poverty. Poverty always haunts mankind in many parts of the world, being the cause and create repercussions in the form of other social and economical problems. Various scholars and economic thoughts have proposed various solutions to solve the ongoing problems. However, although progress has been relatively quite successful in some parts of the world, many others saw the worsening of the conditions, restraining them to accessing even basic needs such as food. From the statistical data, it has been shown that almost 10% of the world population, nearly reached 700 million people, live below the World Bank extreme poverty line or below $1.9 a day in 2018. Also seems very large. This is actually a massive reduction from 1990's number of 36% of the world population, reached about 1.9 billion people at a time. The progress is definitely getting better. However, we must admit that those who currently living below poverty line are in a very miserable conditions, not to mention the widening inequality between the rich and the poor. In the recent years, the progress of eliminating poverty has been slowing down because to reach those who are still living below the poverty line, their surroundings environment poses challenges for the relevant authorities that are in charge to improve their living conditions. War, lack of infrastructure and funding, and conflicts are just some challenges to mention that hinder the progress of poverty elimination. Especially since 2020, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has dropped 97 million more people into extreme poverty, an 11% increase. Numerous studies have shown that the quality of institutions is capable to influence the rate of economic growth and the distribution of economic resources, both of which are required for poverty alleviation. For example, in their book titled Wealth of Nations, Darren Asamoah and James Robinson stated their findings about the importance of types of institutions. They found that there are two types of institutions, which are extractive institutions and inclusive institutions. They explain that inclusive institutions have focused on power sharing, technological advancement, and education, which are prevalent in many developed nations, while extractive institutions tend to divert resources away from overall societal wealth to benefit only a few, which are prevalent in many developing countries and low-income countries. The types of institutions itself got shaped by the specific history of a nation. For example, the event of industrial revolution played an integral role in the long-term development of institutions in particular countries. In many countries with a history of colonialism, the institutions tend to be extractive because of the colonial legacy. Another finding by Darren Asamoah in 2001 shows evidence of reversal of fortune, a negative correlation between economic prosperity in year 1500 and in the modern day. Across the world, adverse effects of colonialism can be seen in places like Caribbean and Latin America, many parts of Asia, and especially in Africa. Other than story, institutions also got shaped by politics and particularly democracy, which politics and institutions account for a large portion of the difference in poverty among many wealthy democracies. Stable democracies are more effective and responsive in channeling state resources toward reducing economic inequality, whereas weak or new democracies, which are mostly in the developing countries, have less chance and channels for the mobilizations of the poor toward poverty eliminations and channeling resources. From these propositions, now we need to ask, are there possible correlated factors for explaining the relationship between institutions and poverty? For the analysis, we will make two variables as dependent variables, which are poverty rate and the Gini coefficient. The poverty rate will use World Bank extreme poverty rate, which stood at living on less than $1.9 a day. Gini coefficient, defined as measure of statistical dispersions to represent wealth inequality in a society. It is being used to balance out the fact that a lower poverty rate in a country doesn't always mean a better life quality. Thus, Gini coefficient was included to weigh up that effect. Then for independent variables, we use 9 indicators. The first to be explained are education, HDI, FDI, and political rights index. Education shows governance expenditure on education. HDI shows composite index of average achievement across critical dimensions of human development. FDI measures net capital inflows to acquire a long-term management stake. And political rights denotes the degree of electoral freedom and government functioning. The next 5 are control of corruption, political stability, government effectiveness, voice and accountability, and rule of law, which are also known as world governance indicators. A data set compiled by the World Bank summarizing the views on the quality of governance. All 5 are going to measure how inclusive the governance institutions in the country. That latter will be correlated with 3 key factors, which are state policies, institutions, and rule of law and regulations in ensuring how quality of institutions can solve the problem of poverty. The values of the variable comes from what data that spans 20 years from year 2000 until 2020. After conducting quantitative analysis of the 9 variables, the result will then be matched and correlated with the 3 key factors. The variables are shaping the 3 key factors affecting how effective they are in poverty eliminations. State policies reduces poverty by a combination of social policy and regulatory activities, institutions in wealth distribution, while rule of law supports the rights and access to development. Before getting into the quantitative approach, the qualitative approach used here are literature reviews and triangulations. literature reviews comes from several past papers as references, while triangulation means mixing of data or methods in order to construct diverse viewpoints or standpoints on a particular topic. Here we are using triangulation by combining qualitative and quantitative approaches that will be explained by my partner along with other findings.
Thank you, Aaron, for the explanation. After we discuss the qualitative analysis of our paper, the next thing we want to talk about is the quantitative analysis of our paper. Here, we use various methods such as VIF, lasso regression, race regression, Pearson correlation, and multivariate regression analysis. VIF measures the collinearity in each variable used in the analysis. This was done to ensure that only those variables with a low level of collinearity are being used for the regression analysis to get rid of the multicollinearity problems. The second method that we used in this analysis is the Pearson correlation. This method was used to ensure our second safety net on the multicollinearity problems that is being faced by regression analysis. After we consider which set of variables from those two analyses to get rid of, we conduct the multivariate regression analysis, which stands for biodependent variables analysis of Euler's regression. The first method that we use in this analysis is race regression. In short, race is a type of regression that doesn't face a multicollinearity problem due to its nature, since they impose a penalty function to not inflate the regression coefficient. The last method we use in this is the lasso regression. It is a similar method to race regression, but they impose a larger penalty function, which can derive a variable coefficient to 0 if they are not the most relevant variables among variables that are being included in the analysis to predict the dependent variables. Next, we have the quantitative methods results. For the VIF, if a variable has a score higher than 10, it means that it has a high multicollinearity problems. Based on the VIF analysis on Gini coefficient, there are 3 variables that we must get rid of to conduct the multivariate regression analysis, which are the government effectiveness, rule of law, and concept of corruption. The same case goes for the VIF analysis on property day, variable or property rights. The second one is the Pearson correlation. If a variable has a Pearson correlation score above 0.8, it means that it has a high multicollinearity problems. From the second method, we can see that there are some groups of variables such as government effectiveness, regular quality, and rule of law that have a Pearson coefficient of higher than 0.8 score. Thus, we should get rid of those variables to get rid of multicollinearity problems prior we conduct the multivariate regression analysis. After ensuring that there are no more variables that have high multicollinearity, we conduct the multivariate regression analysis and have the results as stated in the presentation. We can see that variables like FDI, education, pulse type are highly statistically significant on the Gini coefficient. Meanwhile, variables like VNA, pulse type, and SDI are highly statistically significant on regression the poverty rates. Next step, we conduct the race regression to totally make multicollinearity not a problem anymore. Race and lasso regression will be the perfect fit for this. From which, we can see that 3 variables such as education, government effectiveness, and concept of corruption do not contribute as high as other variables to regress Gini coefficient. For the poverty rates, variables like education, government effectiveness, regulation of quality, rule of law, and concept of corruption do not contribute as high as other variables to regress poverty rates. The last method that we use in this analysis is lasso regression. As we have mentioned before, this method can push the coefficient of variables that are irrelevant to 0. Thus, we can see that there is one variable that is being pushed to 0, which is the concept of correlation or regression to Gini coefficient. On poverty rates, there are 3 variables that are being pushed to 0. Those 3 are government effectiveness, rule of law, and concept of corruption. Next, we talk about our quantitative method findings. Since there are limited resources that everyone has in the world, including the government, we think that it will be the best fit for us to come up with an idea to advise these things to policymakers as to which factor should be prioritized first based on our quantitative methods findings to improve a country, based on the poverty rates and Gini coefficient as a good measurement of prosperity if those two were combined. This was done through creating a priority ranking based on each variable's coefficient and is statistically significant based on multivariate regression analysis, race regression, and lasso regression. First, so our poverty rates, a country should prioritize improving its Human Development Index. This is true since from our quantitative methods, SGI has the biggest influence on lowering poverty rates since it is negatively correlated and has the highest coefficient on regression on poverty rates and big effect on lowering the Gini coefficient of a nation. The second variable that a nation must focus on is in improving their pulse type variable, which are the political stability, with the same reasons of why it was chosen as the variable that was chosen as first prioritized for a nation. Maybe you suffer wondering why not VNA variable that wasn't chosen for the second prioritized of a country to lower poverty rates. It will be answered in the next findings. The next findings come from quantitative methods analysis on the Gini coefficient. The first and the second variables that were selected in this part are the same variables as those variables that are being selected in the quantitative finding on poverty rates. In addition, to answer the question before of why we select pole step as our second variable to prioritize, it's because despite being lower on the influence compared to other variables like VNA on poverty rates and FDI on Gini coefficient, pole step variables affects Gini and poverty rates at the same time. Those we make them as the second priorities. So how does our quantitative analysis correlates with our qualitative analysis? To find the correlation between those two, we use a framework called triangulation, which acts as the link between the quantitative and qualitative approaches, a framework builder for the graph above. Thus, by using this framework, we found that historical factors and other institutions affect present institutions' features. For example, and associated with extractive institutions, resource misallocation leads to market inefficiencies, which eventually leads to poverty. Okay, to sum up, Asamaguda and Robinson in 2012 discussed past variables, including the impact of colonialism and key historical events on the establishment of institutions in countries. And in the present, there are three important factors that influence the present, such as the state policies, institutions, and the role of law or regulations. And based on the historical facts and presence, we can start thinking of the future by prioritizing variables that could eliminate poverty and profit equality through statistical predictive analysis or our quantitative methods findings that we have been mentioned for. Thank you.